Chapter 9, Angola and Namibia. Section 1, Namibian refugees and Angolan artists. Former German colony of southwest Africa had been granted as a League of Nations mandate to Britain in 1919. Britain passed it on to be administered by South Africa. This had the effect that the, quote, sacred trust of civilization to lead the country towards independence was ignored for 60 years, and from 1948 the country also suffered the imposition of apartheid. Namibia's lonely struggle for independence got much less attention than that of South Africa. But for the unremitting efforts of the Reverend Michael Scott, the country might very likely have been annexed by South Africa. Chikedi Khama invited Scott to Sirui, now in Botswana, and introduced him to some leaders of the scattered Herero people who had fled the German genocide in Namibia, while those still alive in Namibia were living in conditions as bad as under German rule. Scott managed to meet and befriend Chief Hosea Kutako, and, well briefed, took their case to the United Nations, soon broadening his efforts to include all the African population of Namibia. I went to a talk by Michael Scott at Woodbrook, the Quaker College in Birmingham in 1954, and I can testify to the passion of this seemingly modest man. Having single-handedly alerted the world of Namibia's case, Scott continued fighting against oppression in South Africa, trying to stop the creation of the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, and supporting the struggle of the Nagas in India. The Africa Bureau, a lobbying organisation backed by David Astor, the wealthy owner of the Observer newspaper, was set up to back Scott's work. The Africa Educational Trust and the Minority Rights Group both grew from Scott's efforts. Mrs. Connell Auld Leggett, a wealthy Scottish lady who was so inspired by a talk by Michael Scott that she set up a trust for education in Africa, of which I'm currently the chair. SWAPO, the principal Namibian liberation movement, was founded in 1960, and the UN, with an increasing number of African member states in the 1960s, took an increasing interest in the situation, condemning South Africa and, in preparation for eventual independence, sponsoring an institution for Namibia in Lusaka, directed for a time by my former student, Yobert Shamapande. My first contact with Namibians was with Ottilie Abrahams, who was our colleague at Chizongwe School in Zambia, and her husband, the popular Dr. Kenneth. Our next contact was in Leicester with Paul, the younger brother of Andreas Shipanga, who had been one of SWAPO's founders, but became a critic, was imprisoned and formed an opposition party called SWAPO Democrats. To draw attention to the liberation struggle in Namibia, the German branch of SCI ran a campaign to convert a military vehicle, an Unimog, into an ambulance to send to the Namibian refugees in Angola, an example of swords into ploughshares. The Unimog came to London in June 1998 and parked in Covent Garden Piazza. The nearby Africa Centre, where I was working, organised a photographic exhibition, a discussion forum and a benefit concert. The vehicle was then sent on to Angola, where most of the Namibian refugees were based after the end of Portuguese rule in 1975. In 1986, SCI's East-West Commission discussed with CIVSAG, which was the coordinating body for the youth movements in the communist countries, the idea of a joint project which fitted the criteria of both organisations. The plan was to build a training centre for young Namibians in the large refugee complex in Kwanza Sul province of Angola. As SCI's Africa man, I was asked, or maybe I offered, to go to Angola on a joint field visit with Atanas Rupchov, the Bulgarian secretary of CIVSAG. So, in June 1988, I flew to Angola on Aeroflot. The plane was pleasantly empty when it left Moscow. It landed at the scruffy little airport at Simferopol in the Crimea, and here a large number of burly Russians filled all the empty seats. These turned out to be fishermen returning from leave for a 6-month stint in Angola. After our arrival in Luanda, Atanas and I had detailed discussions about our joint project with Hadino Hishongwa, the head of the SWAPO Youth League, and we visited the grand old man, Andimba Toivo Yatoivo, who, together with Sam Nujoma, Angola's new first president, had pioneered SWAPO. He was most appreciative of SCI's donation of the Unimog. A day later, we met up in Viana, just outside Luanda, where a convoy assembled to take us to Kwanza Sul. There was still a state of unresolved civil war, and in places the road was puckered with deep potholes caused by landmines. Military vehicles went ahead of us and followed behind. Our driver put on a soldier's uniform and he had a Kalashnikov beside him, which was pointing towards me. He assured me it was locked. We stopped for breakfast of tinned beef, marked a gift from Finland. With us in the convoy was Nangolo Mbumba, at that time a teacher at the refugee centre and later to hold many ministerial posts in Free Namibia. The landscape was mostly uninhabited and flat, with scattered baobab trees and giant euphorbias. We passed through the struggling little town of Dondo, with its decaying colonial villas, and crossed the big bridge over the Kwanza River, which had been destroyed in the war and rebuilt by the Cubans, turning off to the small town of Kalulu and through hills and coffee plantations to the refugee camp. I think this was the cleanest and best organised refugee camp I have ever seen, just as Windhoek, Namibia's capital, is the cleanest city in Africa, or was until Kigali, Rwanda overtook it. At the camp, we were housed in an air-conditioned prefabricated guest house inherited from a Swedish construction company. We were shown round the well-constructed wooden and concrete buildings. We visited the teacher training centre, the kindergarten, tailoring and shoemaking workshops, the garage, the brickworks, a carpentry project, and the trade union centre. We were shown the site of our proposed youth training centre. An architect's drawing had been prepared for 3 buildings, providing for cultural activities, sports, and training in various skills, a library and a cafeteria. There was land for an agricultural programme too. We drew up a list of possible funding sources, including national youth councils, United Nations and church bodies, and had we been given time, we might have succeeded. However, in the event, the project was not needed because Namibia achieved independence within 18 months. The whole refugee centre was then handed over to the Angolans as thanks for their generosity towards the refugees. A special convoy took us back to Luanda, as Atanas had to return home. I stayed on for a week, making contacts useful to the Africa Centre. I visited SWAPO's transit camp and attended an official party where some of the departing Cubans who'd served in Angola were being thanked for their work. In fact, Cuba saved Angola's socialist government at a crucial moment and continued, ironically, to protect American oil interests against the US-backed UNITAR rebels. Back in London, I knew the leader of a small opposition party, Francisco Pedro. His brother showed me around the city of Luanda, the main charm of which is the bay, sheltered by the Ilia and some attractive old buildings in the centre. There were a number of uncompleted tower blocks left unfinished when the Portuguese left in haste at independence. One fine old building, the Hotel Turismo, where I was staying, was later to be destroyed when war broke out again. Another was the Anthropological Museum, which I found specially interesting, as many of Angola's peoples are the same as those across the border in Zambia. The former director of the museum, Enrique Abranches, had spoken at the Africa Centre, and I spent a stimulating evening with him. He was not only a leading novelist, but he was also an artist with pen and ink, a maker of model boats, and an anthropologist who had fought in the Liberation War. He introduced me to Victor Teixeira, the secretary of the Plastic Artists Union, who in turn introduced me to other artists, José Zan Andrade, Paulo Jazz, and Fernando Caterça Valentim, also to the writer Virgilio Coelho. Virgilio invited me to his flat, which was on the 8th floor of one of the unfinished tower blocks, with only a bare staircase and no electricity. Water had to be carried up in buckets. It was impressive to find a livelier intellectual scene than I would find in most African countries, in spite of the war situation. I also visited the British Embassy, where they ran a club on Friday nights, and I attended a party on the roof of the United Nations building. From Luanda, I flew on to Lusaka to contact participants for the Africa Centre's focus on Zambia. Namibia became independent in 1990. As a follow-up to UNIMOG, the international SCI movement had planned a Namibia Solidarity campaign in support of liberation. Now the country was free, it was decided nonetheless to go ahead and draw attention to the country's inheritance from apartheid, its problems and its hopes for the future. A bus was bought in Belgium and fitted up as a small exhibition. I went to Ghent to see it, and I rode in it as part of the travelling team in Belgium, then from London to Leicester, and again from Belfast to Omagh in Northern Ireland. It later went on to France, Germany, Czechoslovakia, Poland, the USSR, which was in process of falling apart, and Scandinavia. SCI and Indiana University published a small book called Breaking Free about the campaign and about the realities facing free Namibia. My next encounter with Namibia was on my journey around Africa in 1991 when I travelled by train from Bloemfontein to Windhoek and stayed a couple of days. Then in 1993, as director of CCIVS, I took part in the Work Camp and Training Seminar described in Chapter 8, Part 2. Section 2, Inside Free Namibia. In 2003, Edith and I were in Zambia, and we took the coach from Victoria Falls, Zimbabwe, into Namibia. The road crosses part of the Chobe National Park in Botswana, and numerous elephants came into view. A large orange sun was setting as we raced across the boring flat landscape. We had booked a room in Tsumeb and arrived after midnight. The next morning we walked and finally located the town's new station, which had been built 2 kilometres away on a newly built line from overland in the north of the country. The beautiful rake of coaches making up the tourist train, the Dunes Express, was standing in the siding. Our little train, like everything in Namibia, was very clean. Normally in Africa, local people sell food at each station, not in Namibia. The only form of refreshment on this uncomfortable, cold 18-hour journey was from a vending machine that sold fizzy drinks and sweets, and we had no small change. So we subsisted on a shared slice of cake and some all-bran until we finally reached Windhoek the next morning. It would have been much quicker by bus, but I was of course determined to travel by train. Andrew Harris is a housing expert who had been the chair of IVS, but he made a new life for himself in Namibia. We stayed with him in Windhoek and then hired a car and drove to see the famous rock engravings at Twyfelfontein in Damaraland, a long drive through mostly deserted dry veld. This huge collection of 2,000-year-old rock art deserves its fame. The engravings mostly portray animals, including seals and penguins. The sea is not very far away, across the Namib Desert. Some of the engravings were clearly done by children learning the skill, a lion with a long tail and an eland with 6 legs. We stayed overnight at the beautiful Twyfelfontein Country Lodge, and in the next morning set off to Namibia's other famous site, the White Lady of the Brandberg. Matthew, the guide, told us about his 87-year-old grandfather, who still rode a horse and still spoke German, which he taught to his great-grandson, and about his uncle who killed a leopard with a stick. We climbed up to the cave. The painting got its name after the French archaeologist, the Abbé Bray, saw a painting by a German artist. The South African Prime Minister, General Smuts, invited him to visit the site, which he did in 1947. We found that the White Lady did not look very white and was almost certainly a man, but was impressive nonetheless, as are paintings of animals on the roof of the cave. What we saw was only a tiny fraction of the 45,000 paintings at different sites on the Brandberg, Namibia's highest mountain. Back in Windhoek, our former student, Solomon Mumbi, who was the Zambian High Commissioner, invited us to tea, along with Ottilie Abrahams, who had taught with us at Chizongwe School. We then took the overnight train south to Namibia's second city, Keetmanshoop. I had long wanted to visit the remote historic coastal town of Lüderitz, and we took a taxi to a spot on the road where the driver said minibuses stopped. None came, but eventually a German-Namibian couple gave us a lift. The scenery started as rocky semi-desert scattered with large crags. Then it became thorny scrub, and finally a totally sandy desert, where we saw a couple of ostriches and some of the feral horses that roam this area. The remains of the railway line could be seen disappearing under the sand. This line has since been reopened. The Portuguese voyager Bartolomeu Dias sailed into this bay in 1487 and named it Angra Pequena, Little Cove. In the 19th century it became a trading post and the Germans established the town of Lüderitz. The nearby Shark Island was the scene of the barbaric treatment and the death of 4,000 Herero and Nama people during the colonial genocide 1905 to 1907, Germany's first concentration camp. Today the town is small but atmospheric with its Art Deco church, the Felsenkirche, and some preserved buildings, including the Gurkha House, the old post office and the railway station. We returned the next day to Keetmanshoop in a crowded minibus and spent a hot afternoon sitting in the hotel before boarding an overnight coach to Cape Town. My final visit to Namibia was simply a holiday in 2015. Edith had died in 2011 and I was on my own. I stayed again with Andrew Harris, now married to Priscilla, a Tswana-speaking Namibian. They live in a fine new house with noisy peacocks in the garden. We visited Priscilla's village on the edge of a wide salt pan where we slept in the cool open air. We stopped at Andrew's own ranch where cattle were being corralled onto a lorry to go to the abattoir. It was good to see that the old location cemetery where we held the work camp in 1993 was now properly maintained as a national monument. I met Ottilie Abrahams yet again, still head of a large secondary school at the age of 79, and eager to chat about our common memories of Zambia. Namibia, like every country, has political problems and hangovers from the days of South African rule, including the still unresolved land issues, but it is stable and generally well governed. Its plentiful natural resources have helped development and reduced poverty. The population of the country is well below 3 million, but there are 17 languages. Priscilla was working on a project to enable all of them to be used in primary school. Nationally, lack of water is normally a problem, but the day I left for Zambia, the rain arrived with such force that we had to wade across the road to get into the coach, and then beg the driver to switch off the air conditioning until we dried off.